In this session, we'll explore the new Relative Feature Line option made available in Civil 3D 2018. Now, generally speaking, a relative feature line is one whose elevations are dynamically linked to a surface. Let's take a look. We'll start with an abstract example. As you can see, I've got a drawing open on screen. I am viewing that drawing in two different views. On the left, we are seeing this as a top view, and on the right, we are viewing the geometry using a southeast isometric view, such that we can see the elevational differences. Let me come back to the view on the left, and we'll take a quick tour. I started by creating some feature lines up at elevation, and then I used these feature lines to define a surface called EG. Just for a second, I'm going to select that surface, and I'll bring up the object viewer, and if I orbit, you can get a rough idea of what that surface looks like. Let's close the object viewer, and I'll press Escape. I have also created a polyline down at elevation 0. Now, I would like to convert the polyline into a feature line, and I would like the elevations of that feature line to be based on this existing ground surface. To do that, I am going to come up to the Create Design panel on the Home tab. I will open the Feature Line menu, and I'll choose Create Feature Lines from Objects. I will then select my polyline, and I'll press Enter. For this example, I'm not going to use a site. I'm not going to name the feature line. We'll keep the default style. I would like to erase the existing entities, and I'd like to assign elevations. Let me click OK. I'd like the elevations assigned from the existing ground surface. I would like to insert intermediate grade breakpoints. This will sample a surface elevation every place where the feature line crosses a triangle. Then I would like to make this feature line relative to that surface at elevation 0. That means no matter what happens to this surface, this feature line will always be as though it is spray painted along the faces. Let me click OK, and you can see the change. Let's zoom in. I will then select the feature line. I'll select the surface. We'll bring up the object viewer. And as I orbit this, you can see how that feature line is draped across that surface. Let's close this. I'll press Escape. Now let's make a change to the surface. I'm going to do that by clicking one of these defining feature lines. I'll pull this end down. Maybe I'll click this one and I'll pull it up. I'll deselect. Then I'll select the surface and the feature line. We'll bring back the object viewer. And you can see how that feature line is maintaining a dynamic vertical link to the surface. Let's close this, and I'll press Escape. Next, we'll take a look at the properties of this feature line. I'll do that by selecting it, and then in the contextual ribbon, in the Edit Elevation panel, we'll bring up the Elevation Editor. Notice that in Civil 3D 2018, we have this new Relative to Surface menu. If I open this, I can select the surface that I'd like my feature line to be relative to. I could also release that relative link by choosing None. If we move over to the left, we can see the actual elevation of all of those PVIs along the feature line. Moving further to the left is a new relative column showing me how those elevations correspond to the surface. Currently, these are all set to 0. If I wanted, I could click at each of these PVIs and change that relative elevation one vertex at a time. In this case, I'd like to change the feature line globally. I'm going to come up and click the Set Increment button to expose my increment value here. I will then click the up arrow, and we'll bump this up to maybe 10 feet. At this point, my feature line is relative to the surface with a 10-foot offset. Let me click the X to close the panorama. I will then select the surface. We'll go back to the object viewer, and as I orbit, you can see the difference. Now, even though it has a 10-foot offset, it is still dynamically linked to that surface. Let me make a quick change here. I will select the two objects. I'll click the object viewer, and you can see how that 10-foot vertical offset is maintained. Once again, let's close this up. I'll press Escape, and we'll go back to the properties. I'll select the feature line, and we'll bring back the elevation editor. Now, let's say I'd like to restore the elevations of this feature line such that they match the surface exactly. A quick way I can do that is by clicking this button at the top, Elevations from Surface. I would like to set the elevations to the existing ground surface. We'll insert intermediate grade breakpoints, and I'd like those to be relative at elevation 0. Let's click OK. I'll close the panorama, and you can see the change. One more time, we'll go back into the properties. Note that we have a granular setting over here on the right. I can set each of the PVIs to be relative to the surface, or if I open the menu, I could set them to an absolute elevation. Now I could do these one at a time, or I can do them in bulk. Let me drag this back to the top. I'll select the first station, and I'll come down to maybe station 1+09. I'll hold my Shift key to select all of those PVIs, and I'm going to set those to have an absolute elevation. So everything at the beginning of this feature line is going to be static. But once we get to station 1 plus 14, it will be relative to the surface from that point on. Let's close the panorama. I will make a quick change to the surface. I'll grab this feature line in the middle. Maybe we'll pull this one down. And then we'll take this feature line on the end. I'll pull this down as well. I'll press escape. We'll select the surface and the feature line. And I will orbit this. And you can see that the beginning of the feature line is maintaining that static absolute elevation. But as soon as it gets to station 1 plus 14, it is now dynamic to the surface from that point on. When I'm finished reviewing the feature line, I'll click the X to close the object viewer, and then I'll press escape to deselect. Now that we understand how the relative feature line option works, we're ready to try it out using a practical example, and we'll do that in the next session. Would you like to explore other Autodesk infrastructure ideas and workflows? If so, please visit the Civil Immersion blog by scanning the QR code or by following the URL listed below.